All right, so this video sort of is the beginning to the next unit, which is going to focus on civil liberties. And then the unit will end with us focusing on civil rights. So it's important just kind of get off on the right foot and talk about like what civil liberties actually are. Civil liberties are simply the rights that you enjoy as like an American citizen. They're the rights that are typically spelled out within the Constitution, and they were originally designed to protect us against an abusive government. A lot of them come out of our experiences with the British government in colonial times, and they're meant to prevent like us from having like a repeated scenario with like our new government, right? Like England like abused the rights of like the American colonists, and like these protections, our civil liberties, will protect that from happening again. So the basic place that we can find most of your civil liberties are within the Bill of Rights, which make the first 10 amendments like the Constitution. So again, the Bill of Rights essentially are a summary of your civil liberties, and these are the basic like freedoms that we possess as like American citizens. And this is what we're going to go over in this unit. So one of the things we have to look at just very quickly is like what part of the government has had to follow sort of the rules and regulations like spelled out within the Bill of Rights. And this hasn't been like the same throughout our country's history. And this has changed a little bit. Initially, from like the beginning of our country, the beginning of the first government in 1789, up through like the end of the Civil War, as late as 1868, the answer to the question of like who had to give you those civil liberties within the Bill of Rights was just the national government. So the original interpretation of the Supreme Court is that the national government had to give you freedom of speech and the right to own a gun and protections from cruel and unusual punishment and the right to a lawyer, but the state governments didn't have to. And that was because of the wording of the individual amendments themselves. So like the First Amendment's on the screen here, right? And like the First Amendment's like probably the most infamous amendment of the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the way the First Amendment begins, it says Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. It says Congress. It doesn't say Congress and the states. So the Supreme Court interpreted that from the beginning of our country's history up through 1868 as meaning that it only applied to the national government. Like the state governments didn't necessarily have to give those same protections to their citizens. It was just from like the national government. That is the interpretation up until about 1868. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified. And as part of the wording of that amendment, 14th Amendment does a bunch of things that we're going to look at in this unit, but one of the parts of the 14th Amendment is called the Due Process Clause. It says that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. The Supreme Court interpreted that line as saying, okay, now, because of the wording of this amendment, the Bill of Rights applies to the state governments as well, and not just the national government like it always had to. Because the wording of this amendment says that like states can't take away your life, your liberty, or your property without due process of law. So this is what's known as incorporation. Incorporation is like the fancy government vocab term. That's the process of like taking the Bill of Rights that only apply to the actions of the national government and applying it to also cover the actions of the state government. So from 1868 to present, it's the Bill of Rights basically governs the activity of both the national government and the states. It wasn't always like that.